Welcome back, everyone, to the Belfry Hockey Podcast. This is Season 2, Episode 12. Now, I want to go away from the book here for a second. I wanted to respond to a very common question that I get, and that is what my process is when I'm on the ice training players. And so I thought I'd try to articulate it here and give some real specifics about some of the things that are very important to me and staple parts of the things that I do in terms of my approach with any player. And now, of course, once you get on the ice, the specifics of what you're doing and what you're teaching obviously vary significantly between one player and the next. But there are some process pieces that are very consistent, that are really undercurrents of the tenet of of the approach of which I take with everyone. So, for me, one of the most important parts is, and anybody who's ever listened to anything that I say, you would know that video research specifically, is the most important thing for me. I don't like to start with a player without having extensively researched the way in which they play. There's so many things that you can gather from just watching endless amounts of game film from them, one of which is how they think. You can get how they think by the routes that they take, and the way in which they move around the rink. You can see commonalities and patterns that lead them down a path to success, and then there's certain patterns that you can see that take them away from success. So that's kind of the first part. Then you also get a chance to see how they move. And what I mean by movement, I mean like how their body responds when they're skating. And of course, hockey is so fluid. There's many changes of direction. There's all kinds of contact. There's timing things where you have to vary your skating. And then there's all kinds of just impromptu movements that come from somewhere. There's not just there's not a lot of randomness in the way people move. There's responses to the environment that create unique expressions of skill, but those are rooted in some type of movement principles. And so when you're watching player move, you can see very quickly how they move and where the restrictions in their movement might be, and how that would impact both skill execution and skill acquisition. So that's the starting point. Get everybody, study their video, understand how they think, what their habits are, how they acquire the puck, how they check, all those things. And then you see how they create advantage, how they respond to disadvantage, all those things, and then how they move. And then the other piece, specifically with NHL players, that's really important, that I really like to look at, is the impact of how they move the puck and how the puck influences their movement. It's important for everyone, but specifically with NHL players, the way in which they handle a puck and how they use the puck to facilitate certain movements, it gives you great insight into how they like their body to move inside of skill. And then that is critical information, because so much of what they're coming to see me for, whether it's to rebuild their shot or whether it's to find greater efficiency in a certain area of the ice, to work on their ability to catch pucks on the wall and make back wall plays, to respond to contact, skating, to become a better, more efficient, more effective, faster skater, more agile skater. Defensemen who are looking to understand different ways in which they can tactically take control of space by using their skating, their stick, etc. All of that. Defensemen who want to get more involved offensively and just learn how to stay within the structure of the team, but then find little pockets and windows where they can make maybe better plays. All of that. It all comes back down to the same thing. I've got to be well researched. Now, once we get to the ice, the thing that I like to do is, when we get on the ice, I already have a pretty good idea of exactly where I want to go. We already know what skills we're going to try to influence, etc. And so when I get out there, I don't always know where I want to how the session's going to go, so I don't like pre-plan too much. I know kind of where I want to start, and then I know exactly where I want to end up. So I have like a vision for where I want the skill or the route patterns and the timing. I know where that I want that to end. How I get there though is going to be it's a very much a collaborative with the player. Like I don't really know how they're going to respond, so I can't. It's difficult to just project. Well, I'm going to do this first, then I'm going to go to that, then I'm going to go to this. You're going to start with something, and then once you're in it, it's almost like sometimes like if you were to like buy a house that's like an older house, and then now you decide, okay, well, I'm going to take up the carpet because I want to put hardwood floors in. So now you take up the carpet, and then you say, okay, once you start taking the carpet out, or you take a wall out, once you start getting under the surface, you're going to start to see other things that pop up that are potential problems. You start seeing the pipes. You're like, oh man, like I gotta have to do something there. It's just that you on the surface, you don't know until you start peeling layers off, and that's very much in player development. It's very much the same way. You don't really know until you start peeling the layers back, and you start digging into it. So, one of the things that I like to do is part of my player development process that might be a little different, and I tried to do it also when I was in the NHL with a team, which is a lot harder to do with a team, because with a team there's so much of like an urgency to fix problems, and player development is the first best part of player development is to improve what the player does best. That's like the first step. And if they have a target area, which they all do, there's something that they're trying to improve, or could be something that's prohibitive to them playing in the NHL. Of course, you have to dig into it, but it's best in my mind to attach whatever it is that you're working on to their best asset. So, for example, let's say what's prohibitive to the player is certain skating elements. Well, but they have great hands. So right away, my first instinct is to go through their hands to affect their feet. So that's it. That's how. Or they have they shoot the puck really well. They shoot it hard. They shoot it accurate. That's a tenet of their game. They don't move very well. Okay, well then I'm going to attach a lot of the movement pieces to the shot. And the reason I can do that is because of my viewpoint on skill. So when I'm working in skill, I view skill with three basic phases to any skill. Doesn't matter what the skill is. There's the core skill, like the main skill, the target skill that you're working on. Could be like a pivot, could be a shot, could be certain skating element that you think is important that you're trying to work on and improve. That's the core skill. Then there's the many skills that you might use to get into the core skill. So let's say it's a pivot. So I want to improve the player's ability in transition. That's my goal, let's say. And one of the most important parts in transition would be a pivot. So I'm going to focus on pivot. Not just one pivot. There's many, many, many different ways to pivot. I'm going to see through the video, I'll pinpoint which pivot they use, because there's going to be one that they use the most. That's going to be like their core one. And then there's going to be like a few they use like in reaction to the environment. And then there's going to be others that could be used for certain reasons, for different reasons, that would just be more efficient and effective in a certain recurring situation. So what I want to do is first, with the pivot, I'm going to expand. First, I'm going to take their best pivot and try to make it more effective, more efficient. Then I'm going to add other pivots to what it is that to their pivot profile, of the number of different pivots that they have. I might pick some of the ones that they use if in environmental changes, or I might pick different ones based on where I want to go. I just know that there's other pivots that would be more important or more effective in the player's overall game. So now I have this list of pivots I want. Now, how they get into it is really important. So that's kind of the second piece. How do they get into it, and how can I vary that? So I could have them forward angle into it by crossing their feet, and then inside of that forward angle crossover, they would then pivot to go backwards. And I could use like a step back pivot. I could use any number of different pivots to do that. I could come at it from any different angle, and I could put it in different situations. Could be like, they surf across across the offensive zone, and then they get to the other dot line, and they use the pivot to fall back into an absorb now defense, or they're in the offensive zone and they surf down to the top of the circle, and then they see their partner is going to get the puck and they want to be available for your partner. So now they're going to pivot backwards to present themselves for a pass. Could be something like that. Could be small space. They're defending in the corner, and they come from the net, they defend towards the corner, and then now the pass went to the point, and now they got to pivot to be able to box out to come back to the point. So there's all kinds of different. That's one pivot, and I just there's 3 or 4 situations I could easily come up with, and we do that. So, but how do you get into it? So there's many different ways I could get into it. I could use side push skating, where they have one foot on the ice and the other foot is pushing. I could have them crossing over. I could have them just skating, surfing across, like using different combinations of skating skills to come across. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of that, I'm trying to hit these different pivots. So how they get into it, I can vary how they get into it. I can vary it from a skill perspective, and I can also vary it from a situation perspective. And I could have like different tools for a different job, right? So I can piece all that together. Then it's how you get out of it. So we have different ways to get into it, and then now they execute this specific skill, and then how do they get out of it? And the out of it is any number of things. It could be a crossover coming out. It could be a weight shift coming out. It could go right into a turn. Could go right into another pivot. They could go, forwards to backwards, and then right back to forwards again, all in the same sequence footwork. So many turn away pivot they could use. They could use any different way of how they could accelerate out of it. They could decelerate out of it, go into more of like a slide stop. Depends on what we're working on. So, for example, could set it up where I'm doing this off of a retrieval. So start in the defensive zone. They come up towards the blue line. They're like closing space. All of a sudden, as they're closing space, it's a re-entry situation. So now they turn their feet. They now go into a pivot. They pivot backwards. Once they go backwards, like they use like a step back pivot, for example, now they're going backwards. They go from the step back pivot, then they pivot again right into a forward pivot, because now they got to go get the puck. So now they're going back to get the puck. There's all kinds of shoulder checks and scanning that we got to get in there. And then now they're going to decelerate, so use more slide stop, or they're going to use a deceleration technique because they want to bring the forecheck close, and then we're going to accelerate to get out of there with some kind of deception. So that's just a sequence of skills, but the core skill remains the same. I'm working on this pivot, and I want to add different layers to that pivot, but I can come into it and come out of it different. And this is the variance of skill that I think is really important. And where I got this from was the study of vocabulary. When I started studying vocabulary, they talked very specifically about this exact thing. So it was the number of interactions that you get with words or skills that improve your overall knowledge and utility of those skills, and so or words. So when you look at teaching vocabulary, like if you just gave someone a dictionary and you said, okay, I want you to learn the English language by learning the definition of one word at a time, it would take forever. You would never be able to learn it that way. But you could learn a few words and that you would understand the meaning of it. But then you could also learn through just reading, which for us would be playing. Kids learn through playing games, right? So they play the game and then they start messing around, and all of a sudden these skills start to pop up that they just randomly use for the situation. They're environmental skills that pop up through playing, which is why we're so all in on small area games, because there is an element of that can happen. That's just one other way though of learning. Another way of learning is to understand different ways to use that skill. So you might say, find here's a word. Now the word is as cat. So it's one word, cat, or you use a word that's an action word. Doesn't matter. And you say, give me five different sentences that have that word into it. So the person in learning how, like what really that word is, the utility of different ways, the interactions of different ways in which they see it and recognize it. So they could read it, they could speak it, they could react to it. All of a sudden a flashcard comes up and it's a cat. Oh, that's a cat. I have immediate a word association. So these are all different interactions. We can do the same thing with skill development. That's been my approach since I started to really understand how people learn to read. It's a very similar thing, because how many skills are there in hockey? Well, there's millions of skills, and you can't learn them one at a time, which has been a criticism of our original approach to skill development. Is we would go in and we would teach skating, and we would teach it's inside edge, then it's balance, then it's inside edge, then it's outside edge, then it's 1 foot balance on the inside edge, then on the outside edge. Then we get to turning, and then there's all the elements that go with turning, and then we get to stopping, and it's stopping, and then we have all the starts, and we have all that we're trying to work on. And then, we're trying to build this. So it takes weeks and months and years to learn just those things to become good at those. Then we have to teach the crossover, and then we have to teach. We haven't even gone backwards yet. And then we have all the pivots that we got to teach. And there's all these. So to learn them all one at a time, it takes too long and it delays the development process. So the reason that the variance of skill is so important is because I can utilize multiple different skills, maybe a different one all the time in a different sequence. I can challenge the player to use different sequences of how they use these three elements together, how they get into it, the main core skill that we're specifically targeting, and then how they get out of it. They can come out of it a totally different way with a different purpose and a different reason. So that's been my real approach to player development when we get on the ice. And so you could watch me with a player. You could watch me do one drill with a player, which we would do 3 reps in a row. So we go 1, 2, 3. In those 3 reps, I would have a specific target skill, and then they would come into it and get out of it maybe multiple different ways. So in that context of the skill, you would, if you were just watching and try to figure out what is he actually working on, you might only see one skill that comes up all 3 times. The other ones, we have all these other skills that are coming and going. And then those become evaluation pieces for me, because the body, and this is where movement and movement efficiency becomes really important. This is how I kind of stitch things together. So, for example, let's say that let's focus on the pivot, because it's easier to just pick one thing and then just go through it. So that's what we'll do. So we're working on this step back pivot. Once I tell them, okay, I need you to cross over to get into the pivot. So then I'm going to have you side push to get into it. And then I'm going to have you, then I'm going to ask you to come up with something that a different way or a different route to go into it. Could be a stop. Go into it from a stop. So skate forward, stop, and then into a step back. There's lots of different ways in which I'm going to ask you to do it. That's 3 different. So you watch me work with this player, and I'm doing it. I do 3 different entries into the core skill. what's going to pop up is a certain there's going to, as we're doing it, the entries and the exits, they will reveal skill stressors that affect the execution of the main core skill that I'm trying to work on. And then that gives me insight as to what I want to work on next. So if the player has a lack of proficiency on, for example, their outside edge when they go to their left, then that's gonna pop up in our work, and then that tells me that if I want to really add some sophistication to this step back pivot, I'm going to need to affect their outside edge. So rather than do an isolated outside edge drill, for example, it might be that bad that I need to like completely isolate it and like let's get some proper balance. Maybe when they get on it, they're way too far forward, or when they get on it because they feel uncomfortable, it affects their balance. So now they hinge at the waist, or they stand straight up. And then that causes all kinds of issues. So now I got to get into some of that, and sometimes I will do it implicitly, like, hey, this is what we're working on, and sometimes I'll just hide it. I'll just get them to use their outside edge more, and I will coach the compensations. Watch your chest, keep your chest up, keep your stick in a certain place. I might use the puck as a conduit to help them with their body posture. These are the ways in which I stitch things together. And I think one of the things with skill development that's really been a tenet of mine that I've really adopted has been the variance of skill is critical. I need to be able to teach and affect many, many, many different skills in a single ice session because I want to test the skill and the target skills. I might have 2 or 3 target skills that I'm working on for the hour, but I'm going to touch on hundreds. And I'm going to use different ones to kind of stitch these things together and stress the original skill and then test the original skill. And then, so when I'm in that building process, I'm also asking for different speeds and space. So sometimes I put it in a big space to allow for speed to get built, and then I'm measuring it over that speed. And then other times I'm affecting it through space. So I stick it in smaller areas to then test the player's ability to maneuver their body in a shorter period of time to be able to execute the skill. And so I'm finding different ways to stress it through speed and space. And then the other stress is pressure. And I can pressure the skill, which I'm pressuring it through speed and space, of course, but I can also pressure it with physical contact. Someone there, a physical barrier. I can do that. I can do it with a stick. I can do it with me physically. I can use other players to do it, and we just continue to stress it. And then we evaluate and this is where my real job comes in is. One, I test the player, but then I also help them interpret the results. So when we're watching it back, or they're telling me how it felt, because that's the other thing. Like, they don't know how it looks, they only know how it feels, and I don't know how it feels. I only know how it looks, right? So we need to communicate to be able to have a common ground as to how this is working. So we're talking about the skill. Hey, it feels better when I come at this angle. It feels not quite as good when I do it this way. It feels better when I use a crossover. I don't like it as much, or it feels funnier when I do this. And then I can evaluate how the body is moving, and I can clean up the efficiencies of how their body is moving, because our game is fluid. Things don't happen one thing at a time. They happen there's many different skills that are combining all at once to execute a specific movement. And that's how the game is played. So for me, I like to mirror the development to do that, but still have some level, because it's still development. I'm there to teach and influence the player's ability to move. So I have to have enough repeatability of the skill, the target skill, that they get the reps in. Then I have to stress it in many different ways to be able to highlight what is precluding, and then I can that gives me the information I need to be able to then build it up again. So that's always been my approach, and then I can create randomness. I can force them to drop it in at different times. I can create different levels of stresses, and then by the time they get where it's game ready, it's been tested an infinite number of ways with every different pressure, and the player feels comfortable in movement. Because at the end of the day, when we're affecting skill, we're effectively connecting the mind to movement. So why am I doing this? What is the tactical implication? What reactions am I going to have or to the environment, and then how can I keep my body in a technically sound position to be able to then move next? That's the key to me to skill development. Skill development is about what are we doing next? What's the next movement? So if you don't have a next, or you just focused on one aspect of the skill, I think that you're hurting the player's ability to learn skill, because you need that variance, and so but it can't be too random. This is why when we really talk about skill development, if you're really teaching skill development, there has to be a certain element of repeatability. You have to be able to, because the player needs to be able to make an adjustment. Because if there's no repeatability, it's difficult to adjust, because you're going to forget about it by the time the thing comes up again. So I need to create enough repeatability that the player has an ability to reflect on what happened and make an adjustment. And then I have to have enough variance that I'm constantly testing the skill from in an environmental perspective, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to happen when they play. When they play, there's so much different stimulus. The environment is totally different. Every play is like a fingerprint. There's a different one all the time. Different pressures, different space, different. The guy coming first time was right-handed, and the guy that they're passing to is left-handed. And then the next time the guy was left-handed that's pressuring them, the guy catching the puck is right-handed. They're two lefties, they're two righties. All of that, those are all different variants. So even though you're doing the same skill over and over and over again, and they're going back on this retrieval 100 times, you vary the events, which impacts the utility of skill and the number of skills and the different utilizations of those skills to express the skill differently, but the core skill remains targeted. That's a main tenet of the way in which I approach skill development. And that's with every player. Every player doesn't matter. But I don't know, as you can see, like when I describe it that way, I can't tell you where I'm going to go with that session. I just know that I'm going to focus on these 2 or 3 core skills, and those will be in the middle, and then I'm going to add an entry into it and an exit out of it. And once I'm doing those things, though, that creates the variance, but I'm hyper focused on improving this area. And once I see like it start to break down, I'll know what I now know what the stressors are and why it breaks down. That gives me intel as to what I'm going to do next. That to me has been a major part of why I've been able to make a lot of really drastic improvements in movement in players in a very short amount of time. Now, when you take and when I say attach it to an asset that they're already good at, this is what I'm talking about. So the entry or the exit would be something that they're very good at. So that, and if I'm trying to build confidence in the player's ability to move within inside of what it is that I'm working on with them, I try to use the entry as the piece that they do with their best skill. And then I have maybe a different type of exit. So it's very, like, I think when you attach attach an asset to a deficiency, the player has a better chance of learning it faster because there's some familiarity going into it or coming out of it that gives them a chance to have their body feel really efficient, and then it leads them to success in terms of how their body is going into that target skill. And that's why I like to use the assets. But if you look at skill from that perspective, and it's basically, like I said, I got it from understanding and studying the way in which teachers teach vocabulary, or teaching someone how to read. You can't learn every skill one by one, and you can't teach someone to read only by reading. They still have to learn words. We still need a teacher. They still need to learn skills. They can't. That's the skills don't just come. The words don't just come from reading alone. So you can't just play games all the time. Otherwise, we would just play games. Why would you need anybody to teach? Because you need the repeatability, and the high number of instances, or the interactions. You need a high number of interactions with that word for them to then be able to not only understand that word and its different contexts and how it's used differently, but how that word is used, and what that word leads to for the next aspect, which then expands their vocabulary. And then when they're reading and they start picking this stuff up and they recognize things as they go, it makes it a lot easier for them to understand how to read. But you can't learn by only teaching single words in a dictionary, and you can't learn by only reading. We still need a teacher. And that's what I've tried to really do, is be that teacher that marries both of those things, where they can learn something and they can also apply it in a game with a high amount of variance. And they have a great understanding of the different ways in which that skill can be expressed. So when the environment calls for that skill, they can execute it. That to me is my role, and that's a little insight into my approach with every player.